Just fine. Away we go.
Alrighty, good morning everyone. This is Sydney Walker with Coffee and Politics this morning. As I've been publicizing all over Facebook that we're going to discuss the current president's executive orders, so Trump's first 30 days in office, and kind of take a look at how people have been perceiving it, but also kind of clear up some of the misconceptions that people may have about some of the executive orders and kind of what is being said about the current presidency. His current approval rating is at 42%, so that doesn't speak very highly of him as a first-term president. Today, we are here at UT Dallas. I'm speaking with Dr. Harold Clark, who's done a lot of work here in the U.S. and the UK. He's a political science instructor here. So I want to thank you for coming on today and
My pleasure.
Welcome you. So, Dr. Clark, have been exposed to you and your work for many, many, many years. It's been very interesting to kind of look at some of the information that you have captured out of the UK, especially with the large Muslim community that migrated there. So I just want you to give my viewers an introduction to who you are and your background and the work that you've done.
Okay, well, thank you. No, my name is Harold Clark. I'm a professor here in the School of Economic, Political, and Policy Sciences at UTD, and I have spent most of my professional career doing survey research, studying the political attitudes and behavior of ordinary people, of voters mainly, but also people who work in political parties, party activists, party members in Great Britain, in the United States, in Canada, and we also have done surveys in countries like France, Germany, Spain, and we now even have an election study going in Hong Kong, of all things.
Wow, so your work is all over the place. So that's fantastic to get a global perspective of the attitudes of the voters and also some of the political insiders. So why is that so important to capture that information?
Well, I think that if we're to understand what goes on in our political system, and one of the things that, of course, we pride ourselves on is being a democracy.
Right.
And, of course, I think that it behooves us to understand the behavior, the attitudes of ordinary people, because people presumably are, what matter most in a democracy.
Right.
And that's really the promise of democratic politics. And so, we've always been interested in this, at least throughout my career. And it's a major topic, of course, in political science studies in various ways. But my focus has been on actually getting out and surveying the attitudes and behavior of people.
Okay, so I know in my community there's been much discussion about voter apathy, even with the Democratic Party being a precinct chair, looking at past elections and voter turnout. And we always say that, a presidential election is when everyone turns out, but typically your off-cycle elections, your local elections, city council, mayor, can have the poorest turnout. You can have like less than 4% of...
Oh my goodness.
You can't. My precinct for the last city council race, 49 people voted.
Oh my
out
goodness.
of 1,400
Wow.
registered voters
Wow.
in my precinct. So that shows you how poor voter turnout can be. And does that have to do with the attitude that people have about voting and participating in the democratic process?
Yeah, I think one of the things that is interesting to observe, and of course there's a lot of work done on voter turnout, is that historically turnout has really been lower in the United States than it is in a lot of other democratic countries. That's right, substantially lower, and various.
So what's the difference then?
Like why? And people, people have offered a number of explanations. One is just the frequency with which we have elections. You mentioned all the different different kinds of elections we have. And that's quite different from many other countries where they're only asked to make a choice maybe every 4 or 5 years. They'll have a
Yes.
national election, and then perhaps if they're in Europe, they might have one other election for the European Parliament, and maybe a local election. So they have less frequent elections, and also fewer offices to vote for as well. Their
Yes,
ballots will be
I
very
can
simple.
see.
They might have just one office here. Your local member of parliament. You vote for X or Y or Z, and that's it. That's all they do. And so that's been one explanation.
Okay.
Other explanations, of course, have to do with just the size of the country and the feeling of distance. How far removed historically you really are from
The politicians'
from the
desk.
politicians in Washington and so
Mhm.
forth. There's been a variety of explanations, and it remains a fact, though, that the United States typically does have lower turnout still.
Despite people being so educated, despite
That's right.
social media
and in
information.
fact, that's actually a very good point, because that's it. One of the arguments at the individual level, one of the things you observe, if you just do a survey, just one point in time, and you take a look at the statistics, you see that, of course, more well-educated people tend to vote more.
Yes.
However, historically, if you look in the aggregate, of course, education's been going up. Educational levels
Yes.
have gone up
Yes.
remarkably, but
voter turnout
has
still.
not. And in fact, in European countries where turnout is still quite a bit higher in many cases, it's gone down, despite the fact the education has
Really?
gone
Now
up.
that is
So there's this
interesting.
sort of paradox between what you see at the individual level, in terms of the characteristics of people, and broader sort of social trends and political trends over longer time periods. And so that's sort of a puzzle too. That's one of the things
Yes.
that people have tried to address without a lot of success, really. But here in the United States, over the last decade, or a little more now, really, if we have to look back a little bit more to the Bush era, the candidacy of Barack Obama stimulated
Yes.
turnout. I mean, it didn't totally reverse the situation, but
No.
it got up to about 60% or a little
Yes.
bit higher.
Yes.
And groups that historically hadn't voted as much
Showed up. And voted.
and
Yes.
voted. And so, and I think that was largely due to his candidacy.
Okay.
I would argue that it was largely due to his candidacy. This time around, Hillary Clinton wasn't as successful, despite the fact being the first, serious woman.
Serious female candidate.
That's right. And just like Obama was the first serious African American candidate, she was not able to generate that kind of enthusiasm, and so
But she did carry the majority of areas that are urban. So major cities, she did carry. I know here in Texas, Dallas, Houston, San Antonio.
Sure.
She carried those areas, but it seemed like, just like what we saw with Barack's first campaign for the presidency, it was areas that typically aren't high when turning out to vote showed up at the ballot box.
Yeah, she just didn't do as well.
Right.
I mean, it is still the case. It is still the case, of course, that the vast majority of African Americans vote Democrat.
Yes.
Large percentages of other groups concentrated in urban areas, a lot of Hispanics, for example, tend to vote Democratic. But the point was, those patterns continued, but just not as many people showed up.
Right.
That's, I think, the bottom line. And of course, she lost a couple of states, particularly in Wisconsin and Michigan. Those kinds of behaviors that they actually probably were responsible for her loss. Right there.
Okay.
She did not have to actually win much more of white working. There was a lot of talk about white working class support for Trump.
Right.
She still could have won those states with high turnout in minority communities in urban areas.
Sure.
And a lot, of course, has been written now about how bad her campaign was. She really did a bad deal. She just really didn't do things well. And of course, it's interesting in that regard. One of the sort of ironies is that I think they recognized in the last couple of weeks that they were in some trouble.
Okay.
And of course, they got the president to come out in Michigan,
Sure.
right the last day before the election.
Right.
But when he landed, I assume he landed at Metro Airport in Detroit. I don't know if he had a private airport, but he basically, interestingly enough, turned left, if you will, on I-94 and went over to Ann Arbor,
Okay.
a community, which is a very wealthy community
Yes.
of professors
Yes.
and students,
Yes.
very good students. But there were very few votes for them there. They already had those votes, and those
Okay.
people were going to turn out.
Right.
What he should have done, of course, is gone downtown into
Right.
Wayne County, into
Right.
Washtenaw County, and tried to mobilize in the urban areas.
Right.
I thought that was really strange to me. There are no more votes to be had in Ann Arbor.
Right.
It's
Right.
a small elite community. What you wanted to do was go down and mobilize your base in Detroit, and
Sure.
they didn't do that.
Okay.
And so it's things like that that have caused people, commentators to say, gee, that was a bad campaign.
Right.
And I think there's something to that.
So then with Trump, he seemed to have energized.
He did. He captured this anger.
Yes, across the nation. Because while I watched it, I thought, can he top himself with what he said last week?
Everybody watches
Because
it.
there was no group left that had not had something negative said about them. And it seemed that he really tapped into some fears or perceptions, narratives written about urban areas and other communities that kind of polarized people, and that was part of the drive of people that came out to vote for him. And initially I thought, well, he's just saying really salacious things to drive everyone to vote for Hillary because she would sound like the voice of reason. And I was always saying, wow, maybe he was just running to make sure that she became president, but it seemed to have backfired.
Yeah, no, I think that you're absolutely right. He expressed the anger
Yes.
that a lot of people were feeling, frustration
Yes.
with politics, and it's a lot of has now been written, but particularly amongst white working class
Right.
people
Right.
who felt that they really had been left behind,
Okay.
that nobody cared about them. The Democrats certainly didn't care about them, and neither did the Republican establishment.
True.
The rich businessmen didn't care about them. Historically, they didn't, and in the last decade or so, they haven't either. And so these people really felt that they
were just being
they were
disenfranchised.
disenfranchised. They didn't have a voice, and along comes Trump, and he says, "Hey,
He's speaking their
that's
language.
right, he is," and he's saying that the real problem is not the Democrats, but it's something called the political/economic establishment,
Okay.
which is a leading, it's the leading Democratic leaders, the
Sure.
Republican leaders,
Mhm.
big business, the media for sure,
Okay.
and nobody is more hated in the United States than the media.
Right, especially
even Congress has higher scores than the media, and so and the Hollywood crowd and so
Right.
forth. All of these people, who we used to call these. For example, in the Democratic, these limousine liberals,
Oh, wow.
extraordinarily rich
Yes.
people who are voicing liberal opinions, but in fact live extremely privileged lifestyles.
Yes.
And despite all their support, for example, for public schools, every single one of them,
Their children
are in the very best private
school.
school, driven by a chauffeur to
Yes,
school, picked
yes.
up by a chauffeur, and so on. Well, this is what he gave voice to, and like other political movements, the Trump movement was what we call a right-wing populist movement, a protest against the establishment, and it struck a chord. It struck a chord, and in part it was due to his ability as a showman, and he could give voice to this and articulate it in a way that was very obviously very forceful, and So he did. You're right. Had tremendous enthusiasm.
Yes.
People would come out to his
rallies.
Yes. And they didn't have a lot of money to give. The interesting thing was how little money he spent relative to Hillary, like just a fraction on the campaign
I think he
generally.
played into the whole adage of any publicity is good publicity.
That's right. Exactly. If you're coming from nowhere and you say something that offends 75%, you still got 25%, more than you had before.
Exactly.
And we saw this as well in our British research on the UKIP party and Nigel Farage, which is really was one of the leading forces taking Britain out in the famous Brexit referendum last June 23rd. Exactly the same thing. And in fact, we've written about this so-called oxygen of publicity effect, where small parties, unknown, political movements, can say things that are pretty offensive to a lot of people, but still there are a lot of people who say, yes, I want, I believe this.
Right.
Finally, somebody's saying this,
right.
And you can build support this way. And I think both Farage and UKIP in the UK and Donald Trump here in the U.S. did exactly that. Trump is a master of the media. We forget that.
Reality TV star.
That's right, and he understands that when he reaches out to people and he bypasses the media with his Facebook and his Twitter and so on, that he's doing this very deliberately. And this is not like people underestimate him. I think he's very smart and very savvy. And do not assume that the things that appear to be sort of offhand or just flashes of anger and so on are unthought of, are not thought out. Because I think in many cases they're well thought out. And he's a lot sharper. And I think this was true. I think that he was underestimated. I think one of the things that's great in life to be underestimated, to have your rivals underestimate you.
Yes.
And I think that the Democrats really underestimated him. I think
the
media,
power of what he was saying and doing, the sensationalism behind it.
That's right. That's how he captured attention. He knows this, and I think it has served him very obviously very well. And he was able to win the Electoral College, and basically ran the table. He won every state that he needed to win.
Yes, he did.
And it wasn't because Hillary Clinton didn't spend money. They spent a lot of money, a lot more money. Ran all sorts of TV ads. And by the way, it turns out, I was just looking yesterday, they're doing content analysis. Clinton's campaign was very negative as well.
Yes, it was.
Incredibly negative.
Yes, it was.
And very personal.
Yes.
Very little policy and very negative. And
it reminded me of the period from the 80s with the mudslinging during that time when not the Reagan-Carter campaign, it was Mondale during that time that there was a lot of, and I just dated myself here with that, so because I was in elementary school at the time and I was just like, why are they saying so many bad things about each other versus what are you going to bring to the table and actually do for the people of the country? Because that's what democracy is supposed to be about, is yes, you get the majority of the votes, but you also represent the minority and make sure that they're also being taken care of as well. So it just seemed like it was reminiscent of that time.
Well, I think, there's a lot been written about the growing polarization. And negativity in American politics. And I think you're right to date the sort of modern. This really started with the Reagan administration in many ways. Although we have to remember that even before that, to go way back to date oneself, go back to the the protests and the negativity of the Vietnam era and the Civil Rights era, and then of course we put a president out of office.
Yes, we did.
And with Nixon. So that said, though, there's still a lot said about the growing negativity of American politics and the perception, a widespread perception, that politicians are not really acting on behalf of the people, that they're not trying to solve problems. You don't see, for example, any sort of serious efforts now to try and to develop a better healthcare system.
Right. Right.
Clearly, one thing everybody wants is a good economy. Another
good
thing
economy,
is
good healthcare,
accessible, affordable health care.
Yes.
And
education.
And education as well. These are what we call valence issues.
Okay, explain that.
Those are things that everybody's over on one side of in terms of the goal. You'll find very few people who don't want a healthy economy and a good healthcare system and a good education system. And the politics of that has to do with how to do it, though, rather than what to do, but how to do it, and especially who can do it.
Okay.
But you don't. One of the things I think that frustrates a lot of ordinary citizens, even if they can't articulate it, is that all you see is night after night on TV is one party trying, saying, "Oh,
to outdo the
other," in terms of saying how bad the others are, and so forth, rather than any sort of constructive stuff. We're seeing it again now with efforts to try to improve the healthcare system. And you just see this barrage of negativity.
Yes,
and
I was going to bring that up,
Yes.
especially with the economy. And I would say that one of Trump's executive orders is called Made in America, where it hasn't gotten a lot of attention because he is looking to expand the use of materials and equipment that are produced here.
Sure.
And for you to do that, that means hiring more citizens to fill that gap.
Yep.
And so to say that he's not doing much for the people or the economy to expand it, that's an executive order that would help spur growth.
Yeah, I can remember when I was in Washington at the National Science Foundation, there already are a variety of orders and directives that you encounter.
Sure.
If you're, a bureaucrat, quote unquote, in Washington, that directs you to do these kinds of things to make sure, if at all possible, to hire American companies, American workers, and so forth. And so Trump's directive is the latest in a fairly long line of these ideas. And of course, the counter argument to that is that it may be more expensive, that we're paying more money. Yes. If we could go around the world, I can find somebody, whether they're in England or Mexico or Canada, who will do this work cheaper. And
significantly cheaper.
That's right. And isn't this better for the American taxpayer? And so the debate is like this, but on the other hand, we're not hiring American workers.
Exactly.
And
so the argument that I've had against that is, well, if you're taking the jobs to a country where you can pay basically pennies on the dollar in comparison to hiring an American worker to do the same job, how then do you expect your consumers here in this company to have the money to buy your goods if you're taking jobs away?
Sure. No, there's a real conundrum there.
Yes.
It's
to
really,
say the least. Yes.
Yeah. And this is a long-standing debate, of course. And of course, the sharpest point on this of all has to do with our relations with China.
Okay.
Where secondarily with Canada and especially Mexico with NAFTA, with the North American Free Trade Agreement. And Trump really, of course, played on this. He said, "Hey, look, this is the worst trade deal we ever did." And look at all these companies going to Mexico, and they've got cheap labor there.
Yes.
And they're fleeing the United States and hurting all of these
our economy here,
our people, and all of these companies that used to be in these so-called Rust Belt states like Ohio and Michigan and Wisconsin and Indiana. They're all have left or are getting ready to leave, and so I'm going to stop this.
Okay.
And that's what he said. And that resonated. That really resonated
that did,
with
because
people.
if I'm feeling like I'm one of those disenfranchised families, then you are speaking to me personally.
Sure you are, because it's my son or daughter who can't get a job.
Can't get a job.
Whereas in my generation, I could get a high school degree and go to work for the local factory or whatever,
Exactly.
or foundry.
And
or
have the American dream.
That's right, and you could make a nice wage. You could
Yes.
buy yourself
A
a
home
new
and-
car every
yes.
3 years, and you had a home which you could pay for, and
Send your kids to college.
and the dream was, of course, that you'd send your kids, to Michigan State or Ohio
Yes.
State or whatever.
Yes.
This was it, but that was fading. One of the interesting things, I happened to be in southern Pennsylvania
Okay.
just a couple weeks before the election, driving along the famous Lincoln Highway, heading from Gettysburg over to York,
Mm-hmm.
Pennsylvania, and I saw just a forest of Trump signs,
Okay.
and not a single Hillary lawn sign.
Wow.
And I, at this point, of course, the polls were all pointing to that Hillary would win. But I said, "Oh my goodness, this is interesting. Look at this."
Right.
And I mean, I'm talking hundreds of signs as
So
I
was
went
that
along.
something that the media was just ignoring?
I think they missed. I think they really missed it.
Okay.
The strength of the unhappiness with the status quo, and that Trump was actually tapping into this. These people were not only in favor of him; they were likely to vote.
Okay.
And they, of course, were people, like we said, who were not that well off, so they typically wouldn't vote. They were less likely to vote.
Okay.
But I think this time that that was being offset.
Okay.
That they had found their voice, or thought they found
Their voice with him.
with
Okay.
him, exactly. And so I was surprised. I'd gone out around Dallas here, in North Dallas, a couple weeks earlier, and I went out on a Sunday afternoon just driving around. I said, I want to see lawn signs. Do I
Right.
see any Hillary signs? Well, in North Dallas, you're not going to see many Democratic
No.
signs.
No, you're not.
But I said, well, typically you'll see Republican signs.
Sure.
And I saw none, none. I think I
Really?
saw only one Trump sign, and I was driving around through Bentry and so forth, and down to Highland Park, and
Right,
all around.
right.
I said, no, nothing. I saw lots of signs for local Republican councilmen or whatever,
Judges and whatnot.
judges
Yes,
and so forth,
yes.
but nothing at the presidential level. And I said, oh, his goose is really cooked, if he
So
can't.
you thought.
Yeah, but then I went up, as I said, occasion to be traveling in Pennsylvania, and I saw all these signs, and I said, well, maybe not,
Because
And
it seemed that he had more, especially here in Texas, more of the more rural.
oh
counties.
yes, if you look at that, that's right. Texas here, of course, despite what some of the media said, was never really. This is not in play,
Right.
This if Texas went Democratic, they'd win every state in the union. Okay.
Right.
So the real battle was elsewhere in the states that had been the so-called battleground states in 2008, 2012, places like Florida, Ohio,
Right.
Virginia. But this time around, as I say, Trump was able to put some of these other states in play. And in fact, even one Pennsylvania, as I said, that's where I saw all these signs. But you're right, that it's in the more rural, small towns,
Right.
rural areas that these people felt finally somebody was
felt like their voice was being heard.
Where their voice was being heard, and it was very much anti-establishment.
Okay, so I do want to talk about the anti-establishment because a lot of his executive orders, I will say that for the media, it's been shown that he's just unwinding what the Democrats have done for the past 8 years. So freezing regulations except for healthcare, safety, financial, security matters. And he's actually looked at regulating the financial system to help promote growth that we talked upon. He's actually looking to negotiate deals with individual companies under the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And Barack actually negotiated this with 11 countries, but the Senate never passed it, so it was never put into play.
Yeah, it won't be now.
Right. And so now Trump is like, well, no, I'm the president, so I'm just going to go and reach out to these countries, and we're going to make a deal.
Bilateral deals.
Yes.
That's right. Yeah.
And so that's something that I haven't seen in my time, that someone is being, take charge, I'm just going to grab this bull by the horns, and I'm going to wield the power to do what I needed to do. Also, looking at environmental reviews on infrastructure processes, because he feels like, the bureaucracy gets in the way of things, which a lot of common people don't like government because of those same things. And here we have a president that's actually tapping into things that we inherently feel about the system, but yet he's being painted in a very negative light about what he's doing. That he's just striking down everything that's for the people. But looking at some of his executive orders, it's actually for the people. And with that being said, I do want to talk about the travel ban and looking at the border security, because that's been a very hot topic. And decreasing funding for sanctuary cities and sanctioning countries that don't take back their undocumented immigrants, and especially immigrants that have committed crimes that are not documented here, and saying we're not going to play games with you and take your people back because they're a safety issue here. So talk to me about how that plays out here, because some of your work has looked at those types of attitudes in Europe with the Muslim community moving in.
Yeah, I think that, well, to begin with, the Trump campaign, again, one of his major themes was to control immigration.
Yes.
And most famously, of course, in terms of building a wall.
Yes.
A great wall, as he called it,
yes.
between Texas and Arizona and California on the one side and Mexico on
yes.
the other. And this is a theme that is extremely prominent in many Western countries today. It was a major driver of support to leave when Britain had its referendum last year on June 23rd to leave. Did they want to stay or did they want to leave the European Union? This concerns with immigration were a major force propelling voters to vote to leave. It was an absolutely key topic and motivator. There is a lot of concern and growing concern in these countries about uncontrolled immigration. And so in the European case, it was really brought to a head last year, or 2 years ago almost now, will be this summer, when they allowed all these immigrants to come, all of these refugees to come from the Middle East and North Africa and so forth, as a mammoth humanitarian gesture to try to help these poor people who are fleeing all the violence in their own countries. But there was a tremendous amount of concern amongst the citizens of these European countries.
So what was the big concern that people had?
Well, the concern was, I think, threefold. A threefold concern, which comes from research we've done in the British case. Number one, and first and foremost, the sort of obvious one that's been talked a lot about, is crime and terrorism.
Yes.
That of these 100,000 or million refugees, or whatever the number was in a particular country, that some of them, a small group, but some of them were affiliated with Al Qaeda or ISIS, and they would come, as we have seen they have done, and they would get guns and bombs, and they would kill ordinary people. And of course, that's what happened in France, in Belgium, in Germany, and so forth. And people were worried about this personal security, national security concerns, physical security. But secondly, they were have been concerned about the economy and their own economic situation. Again, the idea that here are people being brought in who will work for exploitive wages and will take jobs that we would otherwise have. They're going to produce competition for us. They're going to keep us and our sons and daughters from getting our traditional jobs that we used to have. So they worried about economic concerns. In Britain, this is called the Polish plumber problem.
Yeah, so I was going to bring up, so you did some work during the early 2000s that looked at the difference between the Muslim immigrants coming in versus the Western European immigrants that were coming in.
Eastern Europeans. Eastern Europeans.
Yes,
yeah.
thank you. And so there wasn't the stigma, there wasn't the fear tied into, yes, you're going to come here and take our jobs and depress the economy because you're willing to work for a smaller amount of money in comparison to the Muslim immigrants. And also, one thing that was looked at is the assimilation. That Muslims still wanted to identify with their
That's
culture.
Right. That's right. And that the third sort of threat, we talked about economic threats, physical security threats.
Yes.
The third threat's cultural.
Okay.
And I argue that this is probably the most profound driver of all. And this has to do with traditions, with language, with cultural norms.
Okay.
So there are these three dimensions to this threat, quote unquote, from immigrants. It's seen in sort of three dimensions. Excuse me. In our research, we asked about different immigrant groups. Three groups. Eastern Europeans, the so-called Polish plumber problem in Britain, primarily an economic threat.
Okay.
We asked about Afro-Caribbeans in the British context, and this was primarily crime, personal like crime. There's a lot of discussion in Britain, for example, about knife crime, not guns, but knives in the British case, physical security. And then with Muslims, it was a combination of physical security but culture as well.
Okay.
And so yes, we did investigate these, and you could see all of these different perceived threats at work in the British case. And I would argue that all three of them are at work here in the United States.
That was going to be my point with, so the travel ban and, the whole movement of, targeting undocumented immigrants here. And the whole thing about, well, they're taking our jobs. And I always say, well, they're not the VPs at the company. They're not the executive directors. They're at the lower end of the scale of jobs that typically African Americans had pre-civil rights movement and post-civil rights movement. And through education, we've started moving up the food chain here to say with jobs. But these are still the minimum wage or the lower paying jobs that are being filled by immigrants or illegal, undocumented immigrants here. And that whole fear of, well, they're taking our jobs. But these are jobs that we typically don't want anyway because it's hard to make your ends meet with them.
Yeah, I think that's the economic dimension is certainly, as I say, a component. An important component of this. One of the arguments, sort of economic arguments, of course, for immigration, has to do with that cheap labor makes things cheaper, just as simply as that. But on the other hand, it takes means that people who would otherwise perhaps get good union wages, as they did back in the 50s and 60s, not anymore. They can't. Their children are not able to, either don't want to work or can't compete for these jobs. And of course, big business loves cheap labor. Loves cheap labor. That's right. And so for a long time, there's a lot of pressure. If you're a Republican, a Republican politician, you're going to get a lot of pressure from big business. If you want a donation from us, you're not going to vote to restrict immigration. You're going to, in fact, promote immigration, cheap immigration.
Which is very interesting that you bring that point up, seeing that he was the Republican nominee and he's the president and he is...
That's right. But see, it's a mistake to see Donald Trump as any sort of traditional Republican. He ran as an outsider. He ran against the Democrats. He ran against the Republican establishment. He ran against the media, which he called, basically the running dogs of the establishment. These are the guys who put the word out, and lied and so forth about what's really going on. So you're absolutely right. This is, what you see in terms of what he's trying to do is to come through on his promises, to try to,
Okay.
whether rightly or wrongly, he is not doing what the Republican establishment,
Really
wants cheap labor
And
people
yes,
who
more
can't defend
immigration.
themselves in the
Yes.
courts. They can't do anything. Of course,
Yes.
they are, undocumented. They're not here legally.
Right.
They have no rights. Basically, they can't vote, and so forth. So he's saying, no, this isn't right. This isn't the way to go. And so one of the things I think is really interesting, Sydney, about what's happened since he became president, all of a sudden we've got somebody who's actually, rightly or wrongly, are trying to deliver on their campaign promises. When's the last time you saw that?
Right. It's very interesting that you bring that point up, because everything has been painted in such a negative light that what he's doing is basically putting us in this position to dismantle our country and dismantle, the economy, and take us back to, a dark age here in the country. But when you really look at his executive orders, I mean, he wants to strengthen the military. He's actually have executive orders to protect violence against police, to put together a task force to decrease crime and look at deficiencies in the law. He's looking at transnational crime organizations and trying to dismantle that, because that's a network to bring in undocumented immigrants into the country.
And drugs.
Yes, and
right.
drugs. And it just seems like he's doing so many things that when you talk to people on an individual level, this is what they want. But then he's being made to be the bad guy.
Well, again, by the establishment, by the media. His argument.
His argument is yes, the media, they're liars.
They're liars, and some of the things that, quite honestly, that have come out. One of the really interesting things to me, talk about subversion of democracy, was, and we assume this is true, from these WikiLeaks things, was this Debbie Wasserman Schultz being in league with Hillary in the primaries against Bernie Sanders. I found that.
Wow.
See, that's incredible. That's actually subverting the process.
Yes.
Political parties are given through the primary system a real, they're given a legal status.
Yes.
To conduct these campaigns and to allow people who are members of the party to vote. And you assume that, they're charged then with running this fairly. And clearly that wasn't. Then secondly, of course, the case with Donna Brazile, but Donna Brazile didn't get those questions by herself.
No.
Somebody in CNN gave them to
Provided those questions.
And then she gave them to Hillary. And Hillary, if you're in an honor system in a university and somebody gives you a question, an answer, you're supposed to turn them in. And she didn't do that. And so there, one of the things that really looks bad about American democracy was the collusion. On the Democratic side, and then of course there are all these charges about the Republican, or Trump rather in particular, colluding with the Russians.
Right.
Our election looks really bad.
It looks very bad.
Awful.
Yes.
It looks just awful.
It does.
Doesn't it look awful?
It doesn't look good, and I will even say that there's some trickle down effect to the local level with the same things that happen.
Oh well, yes. Local politics, of course, are famously corrupt. Famously corrupt, and have been for a long, long time. But not just in this country. Not just in this country. There are incidents of this in Britain as well. Conservative Party engaging in some very highly questionable practices to try to keep Nigel Farage, who I mentioned before, from winning a seat in Parliament.
Yes.
Where it looks like they engaged in some really things, they broke the law, really, is what the charges are. And it looks like it may be true. I mean, I don't have the evidence in front of me. Of course, we never do. That's the problem. We really don't. And in this age, it's really hard to, to know for sure. But anyway, I'm saying this last electoral cycle is full of things that look very bad for American democracy, very questionable practices, And so, I mean, that makes you sort of sad about it. You feel this is really bad, you know.
Yes, and I will say that that plays a bigger part in voter apathy.
Oh, I think so. What conclusions would you draw from this? Again, you know, Trump said, hey, the system is rigged. Remember he said this
He
again and
did.
again? And people say, yeah, he's right.
He's right.
He's right. And but then the conclusion, what makes the apathy, of course, is, and we can't do anything about it.
And here we have a president that
Who's trying to do
who's
something.
trying to do something about it.
And is getting
He's getting
nailed
slammed, yes, for it.
by the traditional media for doing this, and by the Democrats and by some Republicans, of course, too.
Okay.
For example, with regard to one of the things, there's a famous saying, like a long time ago, Harry Truman, when he was about to, exit the presidency, and Eisenhower was going to be his replacement. He said, "Well, Ike will sit in this office," and he was a former general, head of all the Allied forces in World War II, and he will say, "Do this, do that, and nothing will happen." And nothing will happen. Well, I think Trump is finding out now, because he's used to being the boss. You're fired if you don't do.
Yes.
And now he's finding when he tries to do something, most especially we're going to see this with health care, that people just go there. The congressmen have their own basis of support, and they'll go their own way. And, it's going to be very difficult for him to pass it's one thing to repeal Obamacare, but then to replace it, which you have to do. People rightly demand help with health care, and to do that, it was very difficult for Obama.
Yes, it was.
And it cost him a lot politically.
Yes.
He didn't have a single Republican.
It was hard during the Clinton administration.
Well, they couldn't do it.
No.
And it's a very difficult issue. But what we're seeing now, of course, is that Trump is confronting this problem.
Okay.
And so it's going to be very difficult. People like Rand Paul, for example, have already come out vociferously arguing against his plan and so on, calling it Obamacare light and blah, blah, blah.
Yes.
And so Trump is going to find out the truth of what Harry Truman said over half a century ago, I think. That you're going to say, do this.
And nothing is going to happen.
And that's right, because he's used to being a businessman and the boss.
He is.
I'm the guy, I'm the boss.
I call all the shots.
That's right, and famously he says, you're fired,
Yes.
He can't say that to Rand Paul. He can't say that to Paul Ryan. He can't say that to Chuck Schumer, He can't say that to Nancy Pelosi.
Even though these are people that are part of the same party that he ran on.
Yes, that's right. And that is like a very important consideration. American politics is fundamentally designed to thwart the exercise of executive power.
Yes.
The country was founded in reaction to the perceived like authoritarian actions of a king, a British king.
Yes.
And so there's all this checks and balances, separation of powers, and all this stuff is designed to keep you from doing things, keep government from doing things, particularly to keep the executive, the president, the governor.
From becoming a dictatorship.
That's right. That's right. To keep it from becoming a dictatorship. And so this
and
makes...
an American business person that they're used to having more leeway that would look like a dictatorship.
Well, sure, because that's what companies like Trump basically are.
Yes.
I'm the boss,
I'm the boss.
and you do what I say, and that's not the way the political system works. And the American system, in particular, is in big trouble any time that we need government action. When we need government action on big things, it's very hard to get.
Yes.
And in this era of partisan polarization, it is extremely difficult to get. And you see guys like Chuck Schumer, who's a very bright guy, just opposing everything. If Trump says it, it's wrong. And that's not an attitude. That's not an attitude, I think, that looks good. It doesn't look good on things like health care.
No, it doesn't.
And national security and education. You don't want to be like that.
No.
You want to try to work together.
Yes.
This is what people really want, and we're not getting it.
Right.
We didn't get it in the Obama era at all,
no,
and we're not getting it now. So it's it's basically the same kind of politics, and it's not serving the country very well,
That is very interesting that you bring up that point that here we have a Republican president, and he's facing some of the same challenges that the Democratic president
Exactly. Any
had.
president, that's right.
Yes.
You want to do things, big things,
For
and
the
it's
people.
for the people, it's very, very difficult. You know, one of the fundamental problems, of course, is that we just don't have enough money, quite honestly, to do all the things
Yes.
we want.
Yes,
And
of
one of
course.
the things Trump has tried to do is to encourage the Europeans to pay more for their defense, basically.
Okay.
And that's, in my mind, that's absolutely correct in the sense that they are not meeting and have not met for decades their commitments to organizations like NATO or the United Nations and so on. We've paid the vast majority of this, and we've paid for it with money, we've paid for it with the blood of our soldiers all around
Right.
the world,
Right.
and we just can't do it. We can't do that by itself, but then
Yes.
try to provide education and health care, we can't do it.
Yes.
And so that's just, a fact of life for us, I think, here in the 21st century. And he's trying to encourage people, like big rich countries, extremely rich countries like Germany,
to
pay more for your own defense, for
Yes.
their defense. I mean, they're the guys who are close to Russia.
Right.
Russia's just a few hours away. Their tanks and troops are only a few hours away
Right.
from Germany. And to try to get them to pay more, I think in principle some of them are willing to do so, but they don't act right now. If they start paying more, how do they do it?
Right.
Because they don't have like factories to build guns and tanks and planes and things. They'd have to buy them from the United States for several years.
Understand.
So they basically would just
That
have to
becomes a
give us money,
Right.
But that's a big issue for us. It's just having enough, because more defense, more health care, more education,
Means more money.
more money, more money, more money. We're already $20 trillion in debt.
Yes.
I mean, we can't do it. The whole thing may fall
No.
over.
Yes. Yes.
So it's a real problem for us. That's a big problem for any president, I think. Any president. A huge difficulty.
That's very interesting to see that I would say in my lifetime to hear that a Republican president has such a hurdle to get over that typically is seen by a Democratic president, especially when you have your Congress still being the majority Republican.
They have a majority. The majority, interestingly though, is small in the Senate.
Okay.
And it's small enough almost that just a couple of guys can be veto players.
Okay.
And that's a dangerous those small majorities are sort of dangerous because they give you the illusion of having more power than you really do.
Have.
If you've got like 65, out of 100 or something, then these guys really can't get out of line very much,
Right.
because if they do, you still will have enough to pass. But now, you got guys like, I mentioned Rand Paul, but it wouldn't just be any of these guys. They can be veto players.
Okay.
And so it makes it really difficult to get things done. You've got an opposition, which I said is just, polarized against you. So you really have to have unanimity amongst your own troops to move ahead.
Yes.
And that's very difficult. In the American system, as I said, they've got their own power bases,
Right.
There's nobody more powerful than a senator has 6 years. The president only has 4. And so, the senators are very powerful guys. And they are very prideful, too, the ones that I've met over the years.
They are. Yes.
They have a huge sense of themselves, and they're difficult to deal with. They're great.
Yes.
So the Brits would call them great beasts, and these are great beasts that are tough to herd.
Wow, this is very interesting. So I do want to make note of your book, Brexit, correct?
Brexit, like British exit.
All right, Brexit.
The Brexit.
Why Britain voted to leave the European Union. So Dr. Clark has talked about, and his book will illustrate some of the things that have happened in the European Union and in Britain that is potentially playing out here with American politics and just the whole movement of, America was founded on being a melting pot, and we're kind of moving away from that. But just having someone in office that's actually trying to fight for the American people.
Yeah, this is exactly in Britain. The people who campaigned for Britain to leave the European Union, their watchword was "take back control."
And here, yes.
Yeah, take back control. For the ordinary person to take back control from the political and economic establishment, from the European Union, which was seen as being, and is, quite honestly, profoundly non-democratic.
Right.
The Brussels bureaucracy, not the Washington bureaucracy, but
Right.
the Brussels bureaucracy. And this reaction was, encapsulated in this theme, take back control. And
Sounds like Make America Great Again.
That's right, exactly.
Yes.
The same thing. It had the same resonance. Had a very strong, as I said earlier, anti-immigrant
Yes.
text to it, very explicitly, and they were able to mobilize a majority to leave the European Union. Now, our new book is with Cambridge University Press.
All right.
Be out in April. We're doing
Excellent.
book launches in London, at King's College and Chatham House in early May. But it's been a fun book to write.
I can imagine so.
Really, because it's such a big event.
Yes.
And it's the next book we're going to do is on. It's called Between Barack and a Hard Place here in the United States. But this theme of these right-wing populist movements is one that we see in politics all over the Western world, almost.
Okay.
And there are huge elections, as I said, coming up now in France and Germany, where populist forces are strong. And in the French case, there actually is a realistic chance that Marine Le Pen, the head of the National Front, the French Donald Trump,
Yes.
if you will,
Yes.
the French Nigel Farage, may actually win the presidency of France.
So
And
this
she has promised to take France out of the EU.
Wow. So this sounds very much like the Tea Party movement here.
Well, the Tea Party, of course, was that was the early warning sign.
Yes.
That was a canary in the coal mine, really, of right-wing populism in the United States. And so people who express surprise, about Trump's victory, and of course I'm one of them, really, in the sense that I thought that his chances were probably about 1 in 4 of winning. Even
I think everyone was there.
Yeah, because it was clear in the polls that Hillary had a lead. It depended on how much.
And he just seemed to be so polarizing.
Well,
what
that's
he was
that's
saying.
right.
Yes.
That's right. And you said, can this guy, really do this? Well, he showed he could.
He could. Yes.
And in Britain, Nigel Farage and UKIP showed that they could lead a movement to leave the European Union despite incredible opposition from the establishment. They had everybody there, including Barack Obama himself, coming over to warn the British people of the many negative consequences that would ensue of leaving. Obama famously said that Britain would be put at the back of the queue, the line, for any new trade deals. Just really threatening. What this was, there was a barrage of economic threats that were raised. They were really that leaving would pose this threat economically
and create this
That's
problem
right.
globally.
That's right, exactly, and might even lead to World War III. I mean, they said everything.
Played on all the fears.
Yes, every fear.
Yes.
They called it Project Fear. Their campaign was called Project Fear, and in the end, it wasn't enough. It did, it helped to move votes, but just not enough. In the end, these other considerations, primarily with immigration, actually turned the tide.
Wow.
People are really worried about this. If you want to understand what's going on, people are really worried about this. They really
are.
They feel that their countries are being taken away from them.
Okay.
That there's this global elite,
Yes.
These what I call the Davos A-list.
Yes.
The guys who run the world don't give a darn about us. They just don't care about ordinary people.
Right.
And
we're all just.
That's it. They don't care if you're black, white, yellow, green, or whatever.
What
it doesn't
can you
matter.
do for me to
That's right. How can I make money
yes.
off you?
Yes.
And so that sense is people are really unhappy about that.
Wow.
They really are. So.
All righty. So with that being said, I want to thank you for your time on this topic, and I feel like we just scratched the surface.
Oh, it's fun. It's fun to talk about this. Yeah, it's interesting, and there's a famous saying: "You're fated to live in interesting times."
Yes.
Well, we're fated
we
to
are
live
in
interesting times.
Yes.
That's right.
Well, again, thank you so
Thank
much
you.
for
It's
being
fun.
on the
It's
show.
fun,
Yes,
it's
and
fun.
I look forward to having you come back because we probably need to revisit his first year in office and the cascade of changes that he's trying to promote, and
We'll see.
what
That's right.
has actually been approved and what has gone on and how it's impacted the country.
Oh, happy to do so. Happy to do
Excellent.
so.
Thank
Great.
you so much. Alrighty, guys. So I hope you enjoyed this conversation with Dr. Clark. Again, I feel like we just scratched the surface. I'll post information about his book on coffee and politics, so you can go and check it out. Because when I was introduced to your research and just attending your classes and listening about statistics and building models, I could see this playing out here in U.S. politics.
It did.
And it has.
It
Alrighty.
did. It is.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Well, that was fun.